So Danzy, do you like anything about the show? I get asked this question a lot, and I don't really get why, because to me the answer is obvious. Yeah, there's a lot of things I like about the show. Granted, not so much recently, but the first few seasons, yeah, I think a lot of it was pretty great. The first season especially hit that perfect mark of not only being great TV, but also being a very faithful adaptation of some pretty complex source material. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that I think the show even did some things better than the books. I've always loved the books way more, but I'm not a purist, and back when the show was good, I think it did on occasion surpass the books. Here, let me show you. Number 5. If the internet has taught us anything, it's that people love to argue superficial details in media that are usually pretty subject to taste and almost always pretty inconsequential to the piece of work as a whole. And as someone who lives on the internet, I am no exception. So either by deliberate creative choice on behalf of the showrunners, or due to technical necessity due to the shift in medium, here are a couple little visual things that I think HBO actually really improved on. First up is a couple things for Renly. In the books he's described as clean-shaven, but when it comes to the show, I could not be more in love with his beard. It is the standard to which all facial hair should be measured. Also, his crown, while described in the books like this, was scrapped in favor of this way more awesome antler design. I've legit been scouring online stores for years trying to find a replica. Moving on to the Eyrie, I like the Arryn sigil a lot more. The royal blue is more striking, and the moon looks more like a moon and less like a circle. Speaking of which, while the moon door in the books is an upright double door that opens up into nothing, in the show it's more like a trap door that opens up into nothing. Something about the floor falling out beneath you makes the idea of execution seem that much more grim. I think it really works. I could add a lot of armors to this list, but I think I like the Tully armor the best. I don't think it was even really described in the books, but goddamn if those fish scales don't look amazing. I think it's a great motif. And probably most controversially, because every once in a while I see my fellow book readers really dying on a hill for this one, but Daario's hair color. I was honestly pretty neutral on it in the books, but come on guys, there's really no way you could make this work on screen and still have people take this character seriously. And I don't know about you guys, but I already have a lot of trouble taking Daario seriously. So yeah, this is just an example of a few things, really. I could name a lot more, but these in particular stood out as aesthetic tweaks that I really, really liked. Number 4. An interesting adaptational choice in regards to the show is that it isn't restricted by character points of view like the books are. Each chapter you see through the eyes of a different character, experiencing only what they're thinking and interacting with. This gives you as the reader a really intimate deep dive into the minds of the central characters. However, a drawback of this is that you often don't get to see the really private moments of secondary characters whose perspectives we don't get. One way isn't inherently better or worse than the other, but it absolutely changes the dynamic of who gets what amount of character coverage, and more importantly, the depth of that coverage. Recently, I don't think the show has been doing a good job at all of prioritizing character screen time, which is a shame because in earlier seasons, I don't think it's something that they were at all bad at. Actually, you know who I thought came out really awesome?
Keep away from me!
There she is.
Look, you guys, Viserys was f***ing amazing. I mean, obviously as a character, he was an awful, awful person, and it would be impossible for me to condone the stupid, horrible things he did. But even now, watching his scenes, I can't help but clap like an overexcited toddler. Something about him is just so magnetic that you just can't take your eyes off him every time he's on screen. Harry Lloyd jumped into the role of a fairly one-dimensional villain and said, "You know what? Fine, prepare yourself for the most brilliantly nuanced scenery chewing you've ever seen." It's weirdly one of my favorite TV performances ever. But the reason I bring up the lack of POV constraints being a good thing in his case is that while he has some great scenes with Jorah that we didn't see in the books, his scene in the bath with Dorea was a great creation by the showrunners. You just don't see stuff like this on the show anymore. It's exposition, but it contributes to the world building. It's dialogue heavy, but the actors are allowed room to breathe. And it's a sex scene, but the nudity comes second to the story. Viserys shifts from someone who could almost be playful and charming to someone who will always choose to take advantage of and abuse a power imbalance. And it's here that you realize that this sad, deluded asshole will never be respected as king, because he has no respect for anyone else, even privately. So is this a groundbreaking addition to his character from the books? Probably not, but people are gonna continue to look at me like I'm crazy when I say that he really was one of my favorite characters on the show. Number 3. In the books, Oberyn is sort of an enigma. How you get to know him is through other characters who've really only heard secondhand gossip themselves. Through this you get his motives and can puzzle together his personality. You know that he's headstrong and unpredictable, but it's a lot harder to connect with him. You care about Oberyn winning his fight with the Mountain because his fate is directly tied to Tyrion's, a character you have spent a lot of time with and gotten attached to. Him losing the trial by combat means Tyrion is in a lot of trouble. So, through not really much merit of his own, you're kind of forced to invest in him. But on the show, make no mistake, the audience's primary concern going into that arena was Oberyn's safety. Like, Tyrion will be fine either way, he's got plot armor a mile thick. It's badass Oberyn who walks into King's Landing with a middle finger up to the Lannisters and... okay, somewhat anachronistically, the labels of sexuality. But he's quick-witted, he's charming, he's confident, and most of all, he has a passion for life that you really can't help but admire. Compared to the books, he probably isn't written as flawlessly, but I'm willing to overlook the dumb crap like him spending every second of his spare time in brothels, because the end result is that he's just a lot more fun than his book counterpart. But I think the biggest thing that tips his portrayal in the show's favor is Pedro Pascal, because... think about it. Oberyn is one of those characters that could have been really annoying with the wrong actor, but he breathed amazing life into this role, perfectly balancing both the charismatic and the cocky sides of Oberyn. It was just a really memorable performance. Number 2. So, a big reason a lot of us love books so much more than their adaptation is because we love the little extra detail that the written word can accommodate much better than an on-screen story with a limited runtime. But here's a question for you. Does being more detailed automatically make something a better story? Well, if the detail adds to the story as a whole, then yes, obviously. But what happens when something is needlessly complex? Alright, so here is how Ramsay is introduced in A Clash of Kings. While most of the North is down fighting for Robb in the Riverlands, Ramsay takes it upon himself to start terrorizing the Hornwoods. Sir Roderick hears about this, and with a small host, tears after them. But when they finally catch up to him, Ramsay and his childhood buddy Reek switch clothes. So Roderick and co think they're killing Ramsay and taking Reek hostage, when in actual fact, they're killing Reek and taking Ramsay hostage. So they lock him up at Winterfell, and it's around this time that Theon ends up taking the castle. Theon, looking for all the support he can get, pardons him in exchange for loyalty. Ramsay, with his true identity still hidden, eggs on Theon's worst impulses. Things start to look grim when Theon is surrounded at Winterfell by Stark loyalists, so Ramsay says, "Hey, give me a sack of gold and I'll ride to the Dreadfort and convince the Boltons to fight for you." He returns to Winterfell to lift the siege, where he reveals the truth to Theon before knocking him out, sacking Winterfell, and riding back to the Dreadfort where he imprisons him. In the show, however, Ramsay and the Bolton forces come to liberate Winterfell on behalf of the Starks, and Ramsay reveals his malicious plans for Theon only after he stages a false rescue when he's already captured at the Dreadfort. And wow, does it work better. For one thing, it takes a plot thread that was way overly complicated in the original, and pares it down to Ramsay executing a similarly malicious plan, but on a much shorter timeline. Our first introduction to Ramsay on the show is legitimately scary. He gaslights Theon so badly that he thinks legitimate rescue attempts later on are just more of Ramsay's tricks. This is even accurate of the type of psychological games that real abusers use to establish emotional control. The fact that he's a sociopathic rapist is, well, stuff that we both can and do learn about later. So there really isn't any benefit to front-loading this information because it muddles what's important, and that's setting up the relationship between Theon and Ramsay. Now, to the show's discredit, Ramsay's introduction is both where it starts and stops handling the storyline better than the books. However, I won't get into that here because A, my list of grievances are not short, and B, this video is about me trying to be nice to the show. But highly specific parameters aside, yes, I do think that this is something the show genuinely did better. Number 1 is a scene I liked so much that I legitimately can't not cry when it comes on. In fact, if you haven't watched it in a while, I really encourage you to do so because it's absolutely beautiful. Shortly after Ned's death in the books, Catelyn finds Robb praying in the river-run Godswood and reflects on how Robb's new leadership role is robbing him of his youth. It's a thoughtful moment that echoes the theme of lost innocence that all the Stark children end up going through, but it's extremely brief, and while we do see them discuss Ned a lot later on, we don't ever really get to see their first reactions together after finding out the news. In the show's season 1 finale, we get this scene, and honestly, where do I even begin? First of all, the subtle beat changes Michelle Fairley makes here are brilliant. You see her barely holding it together as she walks through her bannerman. Then when she finally gets to a place where she can be vulnerable, she sees her son and, instinctively, without even thinking, puts aside her own grief to comfort him. The scene barely even has any dialogue. It's the writers stepping back and trusting the directing and acting to take charge of getting the emotion across to the audience. You know, nobody gives a long, overwritten speech about why they're upset. Rob doesn't have to give some insult towards the Lannisters that involves some meta joke. And this is gonna sound pretty cynical, but nobody's tits are out because they don't trust you to pay attention. Bronn doesn't come riding up over the hill making some dick joke. It's just two human beings sharing a very human moment. It's good storytelling because it shows the love of a mother and son in a horrifyingly tragic situation. It understands arguably the biggest theme of the books, and definitely the biggest theme of the Starks, and that's family. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. This was actually a request by patron Jasper Lane, who I want to thank for being insanely patient and waiting for me to get this video out. If you'd like to decide a topic for a video, or have your name in the credits every week, do consider becoming a patron. It helps me to make longer videos more often. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week. I had 5 20-minute scenes where I talked about fuck all.
And I had one 2-minute scene and then became a catatonic potato.